Have you ever wanted to code a 3D game, but just found the C++ and Java applications just a little too hard? And listen, I know it's horrible, I was like 12 when I made it, okay? Well, follow along in this series where I teach you how to make a completely full game using only Python and a module called Ursina. And yes, I am redoing this series to save you from the torture of watching my old series. Okay, now to get started, what you want to do is you want to actually install the module that is responsible for all of this, which in our case is Ursina. So go to whatever editor you're developing in and go ahead and open the terminal. Now, if your editor doesn't have a terminal, you could just use the built-in Windows command prompt. And so with that said, what you want to do now is type in pip install and then Ursina. Now make sure you have pip installed, or otherwise you won't be able to install it. Now for you, it should install everything. I already have it installed, and so it should just go ahead and do whatever that is. So with that said, you can now actually start typing. So you can go ahead and test it out by saying from Ursina. It should autocomplete right like so, import, and then whatever, everything basically, because we're going to be using everything. And as long as there's no errors here, you should be good to go. Now in here, you want to actually create the application, aka the window. It's of course going to be a blank window at the beginning. So with that said, we're going to go ahead and create a brand new variable, just to say app equals Ursina with a capital letter. That is important, and make sure you include the brackets. All right, now what you want to do down here is finally say app dot run with the brackets as well. And now we're going to go ahead and run it, and as you can see, we have a blank window with nothing displayed. As you can see here, we have the FPS, the number of entities, and I can't really read this right here, but yeah, now there we go, you have a functioning window. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started on our first topic so we can actually display something on the window, which is entities. Now entities are essentially game objects that make up anything that is displayed on the window. And to create an entity, what you want to do is you want to give it a name. So let's say I want to create a cube entity. I want to go ahead and set it equal to the entity function, right, like so. Now when it comes to the parameters in the entity function, there's actually multiple parameters you can use, some of which are optional and some of which you have to put in. So for example, one of them that we have to put in is the model. So essentially just type it out here exactly as laid out in the comment up there. And in the equal right here, you're going to go ahead and surround by a string, and there are actually a list of Ursina models that are by default. Now you can use custom models from outside, but we're going to look at this a little later on. But for now, what you might want to do is just put in a default Ursina model. You can go ahead and of course just find a list on the Ursina website. Now well-known one is of course the cube model, which as guessed generates a cube. There's also the sphere model. I think there's a rectangle model or a square. I'm not too sure what the name is, but you can go ahead and play around with this. Now the next parameter is the origin parameter, which is essentially the center of the object. Now you can think of it as the position of the object. That should be fine. Now for the normal origin here, so if we go ahead and just type in origin, we want to go ahead and pass in a vector3 type right there. And then we want to put the origin here. So let's say we want it to be at 1, 1, 1. So we can go ahead and type this, of course, x, y, z. Now the next parameters, the origin x, y, and z, is if you want to individually change the origin. So let's say you want your origin to stay at 0, 0, 0, but you want it to be 1 in the z-axis maybe. So you say origin.z equals, and in that case it would be there's no need for the vector here. Just go ahead and type in the number like this, for example, and you should be good to go. Now the collider is essentially how the entity detects collisions with it, mainly the camera itself or the player, but also other entities if you want to. Now the collider here is essentially the shape of this thing here, the collider. Now of course there are built-in shapes like cube or sphere or something like this. But let's say you have a custom model and you want the collider to match the shape of that model. You just set it to mesh and you should be good to go. Of course, you want to put it inside of these. So there we go. You have a mesh collider. Essentially, that means it's going to take the shape of the model and surround it with that collider. Now, the shader is a little advanced, so we'll keep it for later. And for now, let's do the texture. And this is going to be essentially either your custom texture or the built-in texture. Now, the built-in textures aren't really that known, so let's go ahead and use a custom texture. I've downloaded a grass texture here, just a simple one. We can go ahead and just copy the whole thing. Make sure you get the extension too, and you want to go ahead and paste it here. Now make sure that it's in the same directory as your project file, or otherwise, if it's in a different folder, you need to actually refer to that folder. So for example, let's say it's in a textures folder, you would type in textures/download.jpg. And so with that said, the next one is the texture scale, which you can actually play with, and the texture offset, which are, as they say, the texture scale is essentially the size of the texture, how much it's scaled by, and the texture offset is by its name, the texture offset. So with that said, let's run and see our cube. Now, as you can see, we have a cube with the grass texture here. Of course, if I use one of the default built-in ones, like for example, the brick one, that's a well-known one. As you can see, it just goes ahead and takes the brick texture. We're going to go ahead and put it back to the grass one. And now let's actually go ahead and create the camera so that we can roam around. And how do we do that? Well, to create a camera, we're going to go ahead and create a variable. Let's say camera equals, and then you want to type in first person controller. There we go. Now it's going to tell us that we have to import it from Ursina.prefabs. I don't know why the specific import has to be there, but it is what it is. There it is. We have our player character here. We have the camera allocated to it. And so with that said, if we run it, as you can see, we can now actually move. Of course, we can't really see it moving because we are just constantly falling. So with that said, let's just go ahead and actually display an example here of being able to modify an entity's, entity's position or whatever, or entity's properties. Now, down here, what you can do is you can refer the entity by its variable name. So let's say I want to change the position of the camera. So I go ahead and do camera dot, and as you can see, we have multiple things that we can go ahead and change here. So for example, we have the origin, we have our name, we have our model, and of course, the list just goes on. Now, I encourage you to play with it, since this is really the only way you can get good at it. And there's just a lot of variation to go through. So that's what we want to change right here is going to be the position. And we're going to set it to the cube's position. You can go ahead and refer any entity, including the cube. And as you can see, there we go. Now, of course, we want it to be slightly higher, which means we're going to do camera dot y plus equals our cube dot y. There we go. Now we can go ahead and run it, and we can see that we should be standing on our cube here. As you can see, it is in fact a cube. Of course, we can just go ahead and fall. And yeah, our player character is working. Our position stuff is working. Now to show you another example here, let's say I want to go ahead and switch it to a sphere mid the code. So we can do cube dot model is equal to a sphere now. So with that said, we can go ahead and run the program now. And as you can see, it just turns it into a sphere, right, like so. Now, since it is a mesh collider, as you can see, it will function exactly like a sphere. Perfect. So there we go. We have our basics to entities. Highly encourage you to play around with this. Play around with the properties, see what you can do here and there. And I will see you guys in the next episode.